Got this bottle, and I'm gonna make something out of it. Hello everyone, I am Destro, and this is Realm of the Lich King, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about a project that kind of got away from me and turned into something that was a lot harder and more complicated than it really should have been. This was supposed to be a simple, quick project. Turn this old plastic water bottle into a couple of fun little hydroponic plant vat growing things. And right off the bat, I made things a lot harder than they needed to be for myself by using a hobby knife to cut the bottle instead of just scissors. I should have measured this out, drawn some lines on the bottle, and cut it out with scissors. Using the knife worked fine, but it was really hard to get an even line cut. And of course, once I had cut it out, it was slightly too large to fit over the bottle cap I was going to be using as a base. So, back to the drawing board, and here is where I ran into another problem, because cutting out foam with a dull knife is not good. It doesn't work very well, it tears up the foam something fierce, and foam dulls your blades really quick, so I really should have taken the opportunity to make sure that my knife was sharp before I started trying to cut out the foam. But at least changing the blade around is relatively quick. Back at it. With a new blade in the knife, cutting the foam circles out went a lot more smoothly, and I ended up with some actually pretty nice cuts. So, what have we learned from this? Check your blades. Cut out foam using a sharp knife. You can see that the ones that I've got there, a couple of them are really torn up. Now, fortunately, I have a plan. I'm going to take some strips of card, and I'm going to use scissors this time, and I'm going to cover up all that chunky broken foam with a nice little border of card. So, there we go. I've only made 2 of these because this one is so much shorter than the other 2. I think I'm going to make this one into a broken one. So I only need to make 2 lids. This actually turned out to be a pretty good decision, because the broken one that I made ended up being one of my favorites out of the project. Happy little accidents and all. So, one of these came out a little bit shorter. That's okay. Use it for the ruined one. So these little strips of cardboard, that's graphics medium chipboard for anyone who's asking, are going to end up being a kind of back support for the hydroponic cylinders. Having that in there will help me set a uniform height for these things, because those plastic cylinders that I cut out sure won't. The edges on those are all uneven. Which is another nice thing about those cardboard strips around the edges. The extra height on those things will help hide the uneven edges of my mistakes. So here we go, cutting out a little support thing. Wanted to have something else to help hold that back piece up, and I figured I'd take my hobby knife and cut out a few more pieces of chipboard and use those to make a nice little backing detail sort of piece. Of course, this is where I measured wrong. The way that I did these things, making one original and then using that to trace out a master copy for everything else, meant that all of my pieces ended up being just a couple millimeters short of the bottom of these tubes. I had originally traced it out and forgotten to account for some of the extra space. So my pieces were short, and I was going to need a way to fix that, but in the meantime, while I was thinking about that, I decided to busy myself by making some more mistakes first. Chief amongst them was gluing down these pieces together before I had cut off the beveled edges on the ends. I really should have measured these out and cut them off before I glued them together, because I had to use my hobby knife to scrape off a bunch of cardboard. It came out not super clean, and I ended up kind of cutting this one down to use as the backing board for the broken one in order to hide that. But no problem, I still got lots of pieces. I can bevel down the rest of them and glue those together. But the thing with mistakes is that once you start making them, if you keep trying to push, sometimes you're just going to end up making more because you're frustrated. I might have taken a step back from this one and cooled off for a little bit, and then maybe I would have thought to measure these correctly instead of trying to rush it. But I didn't,
and they got measured wrong again, and fortunately this time I just needed to trim the end of those a little bit to get them to fit. But hey, I can cut out some more circles to cover up the tops of those things, because I'm going to need some circles, right? I'm going to need to cover up some of that foam board. Scissors, of course, work better than the hobby knife for this stuff. Got some extra heavy-duty kitchen shears here. Cut out some nice big circles, and I made them the wrong size. Again. Okay, fine. So I'll trace out using the actual item this time, so I can cut out a piece of lighter cardboard, make sure it's the right size to fit over top of that, make sure that I glue it down, not using super glue, because I don't want to melt my foam through the paper, which, knowing my luck on this project, would have happened, and I got to use those extra circles that I'd cut out after all, and they made a little piece of detail for me, which also served to insulate the foam, as I was gluing some spare bases that I had on top of these. I wasn't about to cut out any more circles, and these are about the right shape to add a final level of detail onto the top of these things. I got a big pack of bases a little while back for super cheap, and still got hundreds of the things left around. Now, you may have noticed that one of the running themes of this project is measuring things incorrectly and leaving gaps and getting things wrong when they shouldn't be. So I tried to preempt that, made a couple of little light cardstock pieces to go in between the heavy cardstock there and the backing piece, because, hey, I figured I've got that border, I need to fill up that little gap, and that actually did work. Of course, I still had gaps along the side there because these pieces weren't perfect, so I decided to run a bead of hot glue down that and figured that would end up just kind of looking like a weld. That's fine. Now, maybe it's not the greatest, but I had gaps to fill and it works in a pinch.
So, turns out the gap underneath these things about a double length of chipboard, so I grabbed some offcuts and made these little feet.
This actually also turned out to be another one of those happy little accidents, because I quite like that little detail on the bottom of these things. Which brings us to the end of the major construction phase, and thus the end of all my terrible mistakes. Ha, no, there's still more. And I'm not even counting the fact that I made the wrong amount of green stuff to start out, had to take it all off and make more and start again. Nobody ever makes the correct amount of green stuff. That doesn't count. So, got this little foam styrofoam ball thing. I forget where I picked it up, I think it was the dollar store, and covered it in some green stuff because I knew I wanted to have something interesting to put in the broken open hydroponic cylinder. Something that would explain how it got broken. And the idea that I settled on was a sort of carnivorous plant a la Little Shop of Horrors. Now, I haven't done a great deal of sculpting with green stuff, but I do know that you need to have a lot of water in order to prevent yourself from getting fingerprints all over it, and covering the styrofoam ball that I'd kind of pressed into shape with green stuff, and then sculpting a sort of opening mouth thing down the side of it, not super difficult. For the base, I just decided to use some old bits and pieces I had lying around to make this sort of weird plant thing. There's a few Sylvaneth bits in here and a couple of old plastic jungle trees. But if you don't have those bits to hand, you could really use just about anything that says evil plant. For the base here, I did want a little bit of extra detail in there, a little bit of extra joining, just to make it look like that plant was indeed growing out. So I made this little collar and I kind of pushed that in and pushed it around with the sculpting tool until it kind of looked a way that I liked. Then, evil plant needs some evil tentacles, and these are really easy to make out of green stuff. You just roll it up and kind of push it into shape. Now, I decided with these that I was gonna kind of put them down so that they would get into the shapes that I wanted, and then later on I would pick them up, come by, and put some glue in there just to make sure that they all stuck down properly in the end. Finally, I wanted to have some wires coming out of the top of the cylinders, the undamaged cylinders. I figured that having some little pipes or something in there would be kind of an interesting, fun detail and add a little bit more to that rather plain top. And here we go, onto the painting. Base coated them with some brown, and decided to use a far too small brush to start out with the silver. Came back in, got a much bigger brush, ended up dabbing it on like that, just painted a lot faster. The bigger your brush is, the faster this will go, and you don't need a tiny brush to paint big expanses of metal. The plants got medium olive as the base sort of green for them. I figured that was a nice sort of plant kind of green. And then I ended up using a flesh tone to set these plants apart a little bit from their more mundane counterparts. Cover that over with violet ink, and it ends up looking less like flesh tone and a bit more like weird alien plants. So really simple paint scheme for these, just, you know, wash with violet over top of a flesh tone, but I think it actually came out pretty well. I think that this works. I'm reasonably happy with at least something coming out of this project. Then a final dry brush of a lighter green, I think this was intermediate green, just to sort of texture those plants a little bit, break up the flat texture. And then I needed to dirty up the insides of these plastic tubes. Now, I figured that water-based acrylic paints might not stick to those too well, so what I ended up doing was hitting them with a little bit of airbrush varnish first. Matte varnish, just to give that ink a surface to cling to. Filled in the bottom of these things with some texture paste. No big secrets there, just texture paste all over the bottoms. And then grab my scissors and cut out one of those cylinders, the short one, to make a broken piece that I could fit around the front of the Audrey 2, for lack of a better word, and its little friends. Then I grabbed some green ink to kind of put around the bottoms of these, just really sell the age and mold and mildew and lichen and whatnot that would be growing all over these things after a little while. And used a bit of my homemade black wash to dirty up the outside of the cylinders a little bit. Just grime those up. Really quick step. Didn't do the wash over the whole thing, just kind of where there was crevices. Now, the two that were going to be filled cylinders with normal plants, I just stuck some kind of plastic fake dollar store plants in there, and I relied on the dirtying up of the cylinder glass to kind of hide that. This one, I didn't have the cylinder glass in the way all the way, so I ended up putting down a little bit of this coarse turf flocking just to give the bottom of this a little bit more to it than straight up brown. The other ones, I had lots and lots of plants in them, and with the black on that glass, I didn't even really have to do anything else to the plants. I didn't paint them or anything, they're just in there, you can see them, it's clearly plants. So that saved me a little bit of time. And paint the last few details here, just use a little bit of white on those tubes, and would it really be a Lich King project if I didn't do some freehand somewhere? Just put a few little numerals on these, some sort of like identifier. I don't know what this would mean, I just picked numbers and letters at random and kind of had at it. And here's just a few shots of the finished project to show what I ended up with. Is it perfect? Not by any means. Is it quick? It should have been a lot faster. But in the end, I think I made something that I can at least be happy with. I do really like some things about this project. There's things I'd do differently, of course, if I were to do it again, but as it stands, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with how this turned out. I've been Destro, you've been great, and I'll see you next time.